This lesson is on comparison operators, and I'm also going to introduce the else-if clause in an if statement. I'm starting here again on the php.net page, and I've done a search for comparison operators in the online manual. So let's just take a look here. Bring this up a little higher. You can see that we can look for equality, but that's done with two equal signs, not one. When we use one equal sign, the result is always true. I'm going to show you why later. Right now, just remember that you have to use two equal signs if you're comparing for two variables to be of equal value. In this case, the value of $A is equal to the value of $B. If it's equal, that comparison will be true. If they're not equal, the comparison will be false. That's the only two things a comparison can be. It's true or it's false. And we'll use those a lot in if statements. Now here's another comparison. This is called identical. Now this becomes very useful in object-oriented programming, but there are a couple of functions that this will be useful for with PHP that I'm going to show you later in the class. So keep that in the back of your mind. There's going to be situations where we're going to want to use three equal signs. For now, we'll stick with the two. A not equals is pretty simple. We just put a exclamation point in front of the equal sign, and it's not equal. Down here, if we put an exclamation point in front of two equal signs, it means not identical. Again, we may get into that later. You have the standard stuff, greater than, less than equals, greater than or equals. Pretty much like you have in mathematics. Let's look at the else-if statement really quickly. The else-if is a shortcut for an if and else kind of together. So if you look at the code here, it says if A is greater than B, it echoes A is greater than B. Else if they're equal, A is equal to B. But it's an else-if. And we do it that way. And then an else statement here to take the default. This becomes very useful when we're looking at a particular comparison over and over again, or looking at the value of a particular variable. We can string these along without having to go very deep in a nested if. You've seen me do coding already where I have a nested if, and I always tell you it's important to tab in and tab in. Well, this else if situation allows us to kind of ask things in a linear fashion, so we don't have to tab so deeply into the code. Let's go look at some code. First, we'll take a look at the web page itself. Back to the code. I'm going to pull this up in a browser, and when I open it up immediately, it goes to the file structure, but to run this, I need to put in localhost to get this to really run on the WAMP server. So I change it. Now we're running the file. So I'm going to put in a different name this time. Bob. Born in 1956. Hey, same year as me. So it says, you are Bob, which comes before M in the alphabet. Well, that's obvious. And you were born before 1960. Now let's go take a look at the code. This is the HTML, pretty standard stuff, so let's go over to the PHP. To the top, we grab the data, first name and birth year, and I'm doing a comparison up here. Is your first name equal to Steve? Equal Steve. That's very important. And if it's not, which it wasn't, I entered Bob. I dropped down to the else clause, and I asked another question. I said, is the first name greater than M? That really means, is it going to be beginning with M or later in the alphabet? So Mary would be greater than M, but Larry would not. So if it was, I would have said which comes after L in the alphabet. But I didn't enter that. I entered Bob as my name, which comes before M in the alphabet. Now going down further, I have the birth year is less than 1960. Notice that I don't put 1960 in quotes, not single quotes, not double quotes. That's because I want PHP to see this as a number. It's a literal number. Up here, in quotes, it's a literal string. Those are the terms that we often use when we're talking about the difference between number values and string values when they're not in variables, when we just specify them directly like this. So here's the else-if clause along with the if statement. Birth year is less than 1960. You were born before 1960. Birth year equal 1960? You were born in 1960. Else, you were born after 1960. Now look, I had an else if here. This allowed me to line up everything really nice instead of indenting, putting an else and another if statement and having to push it to the right. So if you're going to interrogate a particular variable for a certain value or range of values, the else if can be a good way to go. It can be a little cleaner and easier to read. Now, I did want to show you the misbehavior of a single equals. So I'm going to take an equal sign out of here. And I'm going to say, if first name equals Steve, you are the instructor. Let's go back and run the code. So I'm going to put in Steve, 1956. Says you're the instructor, so that looks good, right? Well, let's put in Bob. See what happens. Like we did in the beginning. You're the instructor. Wait a minute, I'm not the instructor, I'm Bob. Let's go back and look at that code. It says first name equals Steve. It should have fallen down below here, at least in our minds. In our minds, we're saying that's equals, but PHP doesn't see it that way at all. What it's really doing is it's treating this as though it were an assignment statement. I'm going to copy that code and put it here. It's just like we said, oh, let's make first name be equal to Steve. And then it evaluates this and says, true. Yep, I did the assignment and I did it very well. That's true. So it always is true. I'm going to get rid of this line. And then it falls through to you're the instructor. It doesn't matter what value I put in first name. When I enter it in the form, it says it clobbers that first name and prints Steve and first name. I'll prove it to you. Here's the you are first name. We'll put that right after the paragraph, and I'll run it. Bob, you are Steve. Now, do you know why it said you are Steve, not you are Bob? Let's go back and look at the code. Because I was Bob at this point. But then it assigned Steve to first name, and when I printed you are first name, it said, yep, you are Steve. I just assigned Steve to the first name. So it's a little bit weird, and it'll drive you crazy for a while when you miss that second equal sign, because when you go to debug your code, you're going to say, I've got the equal sign there. This should work. Why doesn't this work? So do things like this. Put a print statement in after the if statement and a print statement perhaps before. And that way you can see what the first name field is going in and what it is coming out. And that may highlight, oh, I left off the second equal sign. I got to put that back in. That concludes our lesson on comparison operators and on the else if.